Another way to create objects in 3ds Max is to add and subtract. And this is done using the ProBooleans tool. So let's take a look at how to do this. I have a simple kitchen here, and I have this counter. Now I want to create a sink bowl in that counter. Let's just go ahead and move this out so that we have a clear shot of it. Now I also have a secondary object in here called a chamfer box. And we're going to use this as the cutter to cut out our sink bowls. Now with Booleans, you can create unions, intersections, and subtractions to combine multiple objects into one. So we're going to start off with a subtraction. We're going to use this chamfer box to subtract from the counter to create the bowl. In fact, let's go ahead and create two bowls. So I'm going to go ahead and select this chamfer box, position it where I want, and then to create the second bowl, all we have to do is clone this. So I'm going to hit Control V to clone, and I'm just going to create a straight copy, and then go ahead and move this over a little bit to the right, and as you can see, we've got it in place. Now once I have all of my objects in place, I need to create the ProBoolean. Now a ProBoolean is what's called a compound object. It's a little bit different than a poly or a spline. It's its own class of object, and it combines multiple objects into one. So in order to get to ProBoolean, we need to go over to the Create panel and find compound objects. And you'll see here, when I select this, that ProBoolean lights up. We can also get this by going into the Create panel, Compound, ProBoolean. So I want to make sure that the counter is selected, and let's go ahead and select ProBoolean from one of these two places. Now when I do, it turns that counter into a ProBoolean, and then it allows me to start picking objects and operations. So I want to make sure that my operation is set to subtract, which it is, and that's the default. And then I'm going to click the Start Picking, and I'm going to pick both chamfer boxes. Now once I do, you can see how they've subtracted from the counter to create the sink bowls. I'm going to click off of Start Picking, and then I'm going to go over to my Modify panel. Now notice how my object is now a ProBoolean. If I expand this, you'll see that I have operands as a sub-object. And if I scroll down to the bottom here, these are my operands. I have chamfer box 1 and chamfer box 2. Now notice how when I highlight those, I actually get a move tool. So I can actually select these and move them. So I can change the positioning of these if I want. I can go over to a scale tool if I want, and I can make them bigger or smaller. So I can really have a great deal of freedom with modifying these however I want. And I can select more than one of them. If I hold down Shift, I can select both of them. I can move them up or down to deepen those sink bowls as well. Now, as you can see, this is a very interactive way to work with Booleans. Now, let's say I wanted to do something even a little more complex. Now, these are sinks that are basically built into the counters. But if we wanted to create, say, a separate sink that's laid into the counter, we'll have to create one more object. So I'm going to go ahead and just undo this by taking out these chamfer boxes. So I'm going to Shift select them, and then I'm going to extract my selected objects. And when I do, it takes those out of the equation, and they no longer are subtracting from the counter. But the counter still is a compound object, and so it still has operands on it. So what we can do is we can create another chamfer box and use that for the outline of the sink, and then we can subtract those two from that. So I'm going to do a Create Extended Primitives chamfer box. And I'm going to go ahead and just create a box. Give it a little bit of a fillet on it. And then I'm going to move this into place. So what I want to do is place this so that it creates an outline for the sink. So I'm really just playing with the width and the length of this. And then I want to make sure that that fillet is just slightly above the counter, somewhere around there. So once we have this in place, we can use it to create the outline of the sink. So I'm going to go ahead and reselect my counter. And this time, instead of subtraction, I'm going to do union. Now, I'm actually going to switch over to a wireframe mode so you can see what happens here. So I'm going to pick that chamfer box. I'm going to do start picking, make sure it's on union, and watch what happens to that chamfer box. It becomes just the part that's sticking above the counter. So if I go back into shading, you can see that I've got this connected, but there's no wireframe underneath it. It's basically erased that. Now, once I've done this, it's actually part of that counter, and I can subtract from that as well. So I'm going to go back to subtraction and make sure that start picking is on, and then select both chamfer boxes. Now, once I've done that, notice how we have now a sink that looks like it is above the counter. And again, as before, I have all the options here to select these and manipulate it. So if I select operands and select this chamfer box, I can change it or modify it however I want. Now, ProBooleans do create what's called a compound object. If we want to go back to something like an edit poly, all we have to do is just throw an edit poly on top of the stack. So if I go into my modifiers, find my edit poly, throw it on top of the stack, I now have a poly that can be edited. And one of the nice things about this is that I can go into element, and you can see that the sink itself is actually a separate element of the scene. Now, I can use this in a number of ways. One way is to change the material ID. So if I change my material ID, then the object will have a different material if I use a multi-sub-object material. Another thing we can do is we can take this object and we can extract it. So if I make sure I have this element selected, I can detach to extract that object. So if I click detach, it creates a second object here that we could rename. Let's call that sink. And so now we have a separate sink here, and we also have a nice hole cut into the counter that fits it exactly. So as you can see, there's a lot of power to ProBoolean, so make sure you familiarize yourself with this workflow.